on us by colonialists and their irrational demarcation and cutting pieces during the scramble and partition of Africa. So that in many ways divided communities. So of course you find you have tribes that were cut into two, you have communities that were split by these borders, and when you come to places such as Sudan, then you have other historical challenges like the civil war that was happening, the independence, the struggle for independence for South Sudan, and you know all that becomes part of our context for some of the challenges that we are seeing today. It should be noted that Uganda and South Sudan have been enjoying a very, very good relationship. And in fact, Uganda contributed very significantly in the liberation of South Sudan. And it would be envisaged that, of course, having made that contribution and being that they are our direct neighbors, certainly it would be envisaged that we should be on good talking terms. And I know the issue of boundaries really, in my view, might have also been overlooked because the urgent issue in South Sudan was independence.
Yeah, yes.
And at some point, of course, the Republic of Sudan, did not have control of many areas in South Sudan. And to that very extent, it would not easily police the borderline. And the South Sudan People's Liberation Army, which was in effective control of some of those areas, of course, their immediate concern was certainly not about any dispute between Uganda and them, but rather that they wanted peace, but also they wanted support for the war on the Republic of Sudan, as you know. So, of course, as the war ends and as South Sudan becomes independent in 2011, in the quest, of course, to stabilize and be able to cut their peace out of so many conflicted border areas, now we start seeing, of course, some tensions and conflicts arising. And in my view, of course, this is something that can be easily solved. I know, of course, there's a joint task force between Uganda and Sudan that is mandated to look at this issue. Of course, I also know that IGAD and many other organizations have entered into this to ensure that we streamline the issues that we have between South Sudan and us in respect to the border, because that border, as we have said, is very, very critical for our trade. And the significant portion of our trade relies on land transport by way of vehicles.
True.
Therefore, if you have a conflict along the border, that gets disrupted. And Sudan, of course, sits in our economic spectrum, sits in a rather significant position. Why? Because
we have a trade surplus.
Yes, it is one of those countries where we have a trade surplus between $50 and $80 million as a trade surplus. That is a very, very significant market for us. We're exporting so many goods and services there. Of course, you know, we're exporting a lot of cement, a lot of cereals, maize flour, iron bars, most of the building materials,
beverages,
of course,
as well.
Beverages, and then some few goods and services. And in my view, it should be in our best interest as two countries to ensure that we have peace on the borderline to be able to facilitate trade. And that, in many ways, as Ugandans, of course, is directly beneficial. Because the more we export, it means the more money we make, but also the more or many employment opportunities that we create for our citizens. Of course, if you expand your production line, then it means that you have to employ many people. And those many people are supporting so many families. And that's why this debate is very important. That we look at the issues that are at play, which in my own view are not very significant issues. Because if it is a borderline, it is very easy to sort. But you know, when you actually don't do that, people usually tend to have matters into their hands. So communities tend to conflict over very small things, just a small spark. You find armies are now fighting over something that is very small. And of course, Sudan being a young country, there are so many things that are taking place. There are many discoveries that are made. And I do not think, quite frankly, that is, for example, it is Uganda's policy to cause instability in South Sudan. I don't think that at the national level that there is even interest in furthering any conflict
between us and them.
For example, UPDF and SPLA as regards to the borderline.
Okay.
But somehow, somewhere, events happen. One group invades, one community invades the other one, and all of a sudden, security agencies have to come in, and you see clashes that are happening. So it is very important, looking at the importance of trade that we've talked about, for government of Uganda and government of South Sudan to come together and streamline this issue, sort of the border issue, once and for all.
Thank you. Mr. Walugembe, and just picking up from what Patrick has said, the trade surplus that we do have, because even in as much as just 2023, we traded in about, our exports went up to about 536 billion, and there's been an annualized growth since 2018 of about 12.2% of our exports there. What is it that we have kept seated on between us and South Sudan that we haven't been able to tackle? Because any reaction that comes after a fight would be considered as a post-mortem. But what are some of those issues that we should have been able to settle out much earlier on, especially also looking at the role that Uganda has played in the pacification of Sudan?
Okay, so first of all, as my colleague has mentioned, some of these are historical issues because the partition of Africa was done in an haphazard manner. Many flashpoints were left. For instance, Uganda has had this issue on the Mijingo Island with Kenya.
With Kenya, yeah.
For a long time. And you know, they've set up demarcation teams and so on. And still, these issues were not resolved until quite recently when the Excellencies met and agreed to on a mechanism to have them resolved. So the same situation subsists in the South Sudan context. Now the challenge with South Sudan is that they've also been having internal contradictions within them. You know, you don't have a state that has complete control over its own borders. So sometimes there are rogue groups that would come and claim and attack and cause mayhem. And also sometimes you have misinformed soldiers, you know, that, you know, also, like in the latest incident where South Sudan soldiers now came into the Yumbe district of Uganda, and then there was a clash, and then 4 soldiers ended up losing their lives, sadly. So I think that the issue of addressing such historical challenges is something that needs to be taken at a higher level. You know, when African countries got independence, it was agreed at the OAU that the borders should remain as they were. Yes, there were challenges, there were contradictions, but they should remain as they were. So I would say that for us as a country, it is not beneficial to have a fight with South Sudan. It's one of our biggest export markets. We have a trade surplus with them. In fact, these issues shouldn't exist. That's why we talk about integration, because then countries stop looking at the narrow nationalistic interests and look at the broader picture, you know, and that also leads us to query, you know, is the integration process on track? You know, because now, as you know, recently at the EAC Secretariat, countries have not been contributing their budgetary bits, and one of those countries is South Sudan. So we also want to gauge what is their commitment to the issues of regional integration. Because the more committed you are to regional integration, to the regional integration agenda, the less you'll be preoccupied about this border stops here, that border stops there, because you look at the whole thing as one single market that benefits all of you.
But John, do you think South Sudan has had the time to settle in, especially when it comes to peace and security, to settle in and start thinking about these broader issues? Because even as much as just recently, this very week or a few days ago, we did see the indictment of South Sudan's Vice President, Riek Machar, who is now calling on the opposition or citizens, quote unquote, support to be able to defend themselves. So the dispute between the president and Salva Kiir Mayardit and the vice president still remains. Have they been settled enough to even start looking at the bigger picture?
No, they haven't, and that's why they make, sorry, I think that our colleagues make a mistake. You know, as a country, they should first focus on the priorities. Countries that have focused so much on these border issues have led to broader instabilities. If you look at Somalia in the 70s, they spent a lot of time on these disputes with Kenya, on Ethiopia, and at the end of the day, as a state, they lost control. So South Sudan needs to first consolidate itself. That does not mean that Uganda or any other country, for that matter, has a right to take a piece of it. But they should prioritize. They should know that for now, the focus should be on ensuring security in the country. Secondly, it should ensure that there is prosperity through trade. But if you jeopardize these through simple and unnecessary conflicts with neighbors, Uganda has sacrificed a lot for South Sudan, you know, a lot. So for South Sudan that's still receiving support up to now in terms of security and to again now start a dispute over a simple boundary and so on, I think it's ill-advised in my view. I think that they should prioritize at this point ensuring that there's integrity of the state is effective, there's service delivery, there is improved trade with their neighbors, they build internal capacity. Some of the things that Uganda and Kenya export to South Sudan, they should look at how can they engage in some form of import substitution, as opposed to starting unnecessary conflicts with neighbors when the state is not in a position to sustain such contradiction. So I think that they make a strategic error as a country. Yes, it's important that you're concerned about where you stop and so on, but at some point you need to say,
territorial
where do I start
integrity
from?
for a sovereign state.
No one is arguing with that, but we are saying, where do you start from? You know, if you're hungry and you can't feed yourself, you can't start saying, now I'm going to stand for election so that I win the primary. No, because you first need to focus on yourself.